Welcome to the Australian Property Podcast, helping you achieve success in property. Featuring your host, Jonathan Preston.
Hi guys, thanks very much for tuning back into the show. So in today's episode, I want to discuss the February clearance rates for Sydney and Melbourne. If you'd like to get in touch, I'd love to hear from you. Send me an email at jp@australianpropertypodcast.com.au. Alright, let's get started. Alright, so to discuss Sydney first when it comes to the clearance rates, talking about this weekend, basically Sydney had 540 homes go to auction. This is actually way ahead of the figures last weekend, which was 231 houses. And this basically is significantly higher than 357 that we saw go to auction on the same weekend last year. So this is basically, a story where there is much more supply finally coming onto the market, which I can tell you will, bring a lot of relief for a lot of my clients and basically, people who are trying to buy in Sydney, because for a long period of time, it has been very difficult to, find something that has been available. And when, there is something that kind of fits into what you're looking for, in many cases, there are a huge number of people fighting for it, people putting in, immediate unconditional offers at way above the asking price and everything like that. So for people out there who are looking to acquire properties, this will, definitely be a welcome sign compared to, times that we have seen recently. In terms of the actual clearance rate, so it was actually a very strong figure at 84.2% over the weekend. So, that really is a boom time figure. Pretty much, everything is selling and, generally, at what we're seeing as to be kind of record levels. Basically, this is well ahead of what we saw last weekend, which was 78.8%, which is still very high. And last year, 74.3%, which was still, a very substantial figure. Keeping with the trend, so basically inner suburbs, again, performed the best. However, I would note here that the West performed, quite well, despite, some of the concerns around oversupply. And in recent times, we have seen a big disparity in terms of the clearance rate for the West and the inner suburbs. And while that still exists, the West is still presenting pretty strong figures when it comes to clearance rates right now. So basically, the median we saw over the weekend was 1.2 million in Sydney. That's compared with 1.1 million last weekend and 1,041,500 on this weekend last year. Now, to quickly go through the actual breakdowns, if we look at the lower North Shore, there was a clearance rate of 94.6%. Inner West, 93.3%. City and East, 88.1%. Canterbury Bankstown, 83.3%. Central Coast, 82.4%. Upper North Shore, 82%. Southwest Sydney, 81.8%. So that's a very substantial figure compared to some of the numbers we've seen recently. Northern Beaches, 79.5%. South Sydney, 78.3%. Northwest, 78.3%. Western Sydney, 68.4%. And the Blue Mountains at 50%. But there were only 2 properties that went to auction and one of them sold. So that's why Blue Mountains is down at 50%. Next weekend, we'll see actually 700 homes go to auction, most likely. So that's going to be another big test for the market, and it will be very interesting to see how that plays out for Sydney. Now, to talk a little bit about Melbourne, over the weekend, we saw 470 homes go into the hammer. That's compared with last weekend to 192 and 466 in the same weekend last year. Now, the overall clearance rate was 78.7%. That's almost identical to what we saw last weekend at 78.5% and is quite a bit higher than the 75% rate seen on the same Saturday last year. Melbourne's median was 752,000 on Saturday, compared to 652,500 last weekend and 710,000 on this weekend last year. So you can see that massive disparity in between the medians of Sydney and Melbourne there. Now, to talk a bit about the clearance rates for each area in Melbourne, so the northeast was 91.4%, north 87.5%, inner east 86.4%, west 80.3%, outer east 76.6%, inner south 76.4%, southeast 72.4%, and inner urban 67.6%. So pretty strong, most of those figures. The inner urban figure definitely, a little bit lower than the other areas, but in general, the figures are quite strong. And next weekend, we're actually going to see 900 homes go under the hammer in Melbourne. So I think this is going to be definitely, again, welcome relief for people who've been trying to buy. I know both Sydney and Melbourne right now are extremely competitive when it comes to buying properties. Right now, what we're seeing is a lot of owner-occupier demand. People have been sort of, getting their pre-approvals ready, saving their deposits, looking to enter the market in the last year. I know personally a lot of people I've spoken to, they've got their money ready and they're going out there, they're getting a pre-approval, they're getting the sign-off from the bank, and then they're trying to buy something and they're finding it just to be very, very difficult. They're finding that there is, extreme competition for a lot of these properties, basically, especially stuff that is close to the median or even on the, the lower end of the median. There just is extreme competition. They're turning up and stuff is, a lot of times either you have to buy it for way over the sort of price point if you want to buy it before auction and you need to buy it, with an unconditional offer, or you need to go to auction and you need to fight it out with a whole group of people who are all, emotionally charged and willing to, basically set a new suburb record if that's what it takes to get the property, because they're kind of, sick of missing out and they, they've had enough and they're ready to just pay the money to get a property. So, you've got to basically make sure that you don't end up buying with emotion. You've got to be really careful when it comes to this. But there is definitely, a lot of people waiting in the wings, I would say, to buy in both Sydney and Melbourne that have got the financial means to do so. But over the last year, the amount of supply on the market has just made it extremely difficult for them to actually find something which, is both within their price range and that roughly fits their requirements. So I think that we are going to see this as, a welcome piece of relief for a lot of buyers. I think that clearance rates may not stay quite at these extreme levels, but I'm not expecting them to fall through the floor just because we do have what I believe to be so many buyers waiting in the wings. Now, with this much supply coming into the market, we might see price growth decelerate a little bit. When I say that, I'm not saying that I'm expecting prices to completely turn around and tank. More what I'm saying is that a lot of the new supply coming on the market will soak up the demand, particularly with, if we look at this weekend last year in Melbourne, 192 houses available, this year 470, and next weekend 900. If you do a comparison, of those numbers, that's, there's quite a lot of houses coming up. And I think that this basically is going to soak up a lot of the demand that is waiting in the wings. I would say that in my experience, it's been even more competitive in Sydney than it has been in Melbourne. There is obviously, you've got sort of a greater sort of amount of choice in terms of areas when it comes to Melbourne that are still commutable distance to the CBD. In Sydney, you just don't have that luxury. Unless you go very, very far, either southwest or to the west, then prices really aren't affordable in many spots in Sydney anymore. Versus in Melbourne, you can kind of go from a number of directions and still be commutable distance to CBD, and there are potential options, in the median-ish kind of range. So that's kind of just, I guess, my thoughts on where things sit at the moment. I do want to quickly introduce a little new segment. Want to quickly add in like a Stoic quote at the end of each episode, just to sort of mix things up and to, keep your mind active and thinking in new ways. This week's quote will be from Seneca, and that is, "He who is brave is free." So we'll leave it on that note. I really appreciate you tuning in today. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening to today's episode. Please subscribe to the podcast, and if you've enjoyed the show, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a review on iTunes and recommend the show to any friends that you think might benefit. Thanks again for listening, and we hope to see you back soon.